Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to have you. We're going to take a few moments as folks join the room to make sure that we have everyone here as we kick off, or as many folks as we can. Welcome to the Budget and Tax Center's Making Connections event. This event is an opportunity for us to talk about well-being and what it means for our communities. I'm going to turn it to our interpreters who are going to share some guidance about interpretation for this meeting. Welcome and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes, yo soy Talis, estoy aquí con mi cointérprete Susan y venimos representando a Tilde, la Cooperativa de Justicia y Lenguaje, y vamos a ser sus intérpretes. Esta tarde vamos a estar interpretando este webinario al español utilizando la función de interpretación simultánea de Zoom. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Talis. I'm here with my co-interpreter Susan, and we are here representing Tilde Language Justice Co-op. And we are going to be the Spanish-English interpreters during this webinar today. We're going to be interpreting everything into Spanish through the simultaneous interpretation teacher. Para acceder a la interpretación para todas las personas que no sean bilingües en inglés y en español, o que simplemente prefieran escuchar la presentación en español, pueden entrar al canal de español. Si están aquí a través de una computadora, deben estar viendo un globito en la parte inferior en medio de su pantalla de Zoom. Como ven en la imagen en la pantalla, ese globito que dice interpretación, y ahí pueden hacer clic y seleccionar el canal de español. Si no están viendo ese globito o si están aquí a través de un teléfono inteligente o una tableta, pueden hacer clic en los tres puntitos en la parte inferior derecha de su aplicación de Zoom. Los tres puntitos que dicen más. Y ahí seleccionar interpretación de idiomas y de nuevo ahí pueden seleccionar el canal de español. To access interpretation for everybody who's not fully bilingual in English and Spanish, if you're not fully bilingual in English and Spanish, you can join the English channel, and you can do so if you're here via a computer. You can click on the little globe that says interpretation at the bottom center of your Zoom screen, and there you can select the English channel. And if you don't see that globe, you can click on the three little dots that say more. That's usually there if you're here via smartphone or tablet. You can click that, select language interpretation, and once again, you can select the English channel there. Solo un recordatorio a los oradores de por favor hablar a un ritmo moderado, tomando pausas, respirando para que les podamos seguir el ritmo e interpretar su mensaje completo. Y por último, si hay algún problema con la interpretación, por favor díganos a través del chat y les ayudaremos en cuanto podamos. Just a quick friendly reminder to all speakers to please speak at a moderate pace so that we are able to keep up and interpret your full message. And just remember to take pauses and breathe so that we can follow along. And lastly, if there are any issues with interpretation, please let us know through the chat and we will help you out as soon as we can. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone again for joining us today to talk about what it would be like if North Carolina defined success as every person securing well-being rather than by growth or productivity alone. We're very excited for this conversation and hope that you too will engage with us in defining economic success based on the measures of well-being that you think are important to you, your family, and your community. We can go to the next slide. We have a packed agenda, but I did want to talk a little bit about the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center and why this is an important topic for us. At the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, we envision a state where every person can reach their full potential and achieve well-being. We believe that's possible when we support trustworthy anti-racist institutions and systems to be built with our full participation. We're really excited about this concept of building in well-being frameworks. Next slide. And we have a number of speakers with us today who will share their experience and their knowledge and understanding of well-being frameworks with us. I'll turn to introducing them, but before that, I just want to reiterate for us at the Budget and Tax Center, a well-being framework really provides the opportunity to think about what would happen when communities define their purpose and priorities as well-being, rather than focus solely on job growth or productivity. We believe that we could, in this way, ensure that people and communities are healthy in every way. We believe that a well-being framework increases opportunity, prosperity, and dignity for all people, and leads to stronger, more stable societies ready to address any challenges ahead. As we enter into the budget season in North Carolina, we believe that anchoring our decisions about where our public money goes can help us to define priorities and center the needs of communities in making our public budgets work for our communities. So when we talk about well-being, we're really talking about individuals and communities that are thriving and that have opportunities to create meaningful futures. We believe that well-being occurs when basic needs are met, including physical safety, food on the table, a place to call home. But we also know that we need to be focused on higher needs like dignity, purpose, social connection, and life satisfaction. So with that overview, I'm really excited to invite Anita Chandra with the RAND Corporation, and particularly RAND's Economic and Social Well-being Program. Anita has led several projects, both in the United States and abroad, to build frameworks that support public and policymakers' orientation for what matters to people's lives. Anita has worked with communities to build and advance well-being narratives, to strengthen well-being data, and to integrate those data into policy and practice. After Anita, we'll hear from Logan Rockefeller Harris, our Director of Research here at the Budget and Tax Center, who will share some data tools that we've put together to support the conversation about well-being in our state. And then we'll hear from Cass Oatley, international representative with UE 150, who will share one way in which these measures have contributed to the work community leaders and workers are embracing to advance good paying jobs. With that, I'll turn it to you, Anita, and thank you so much again for joining us and sharing your expertise.
Great. Thank you, Alexandra. I'm going to share some slides, which hopefully will be visible. And hopefully you can see the slides that I'm projecting. It's great to be with you, and thank you to the North Carolina Center for including me in this really important conversation. I'm also a North Carolina native, so it's always great to be back, at least virtually. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the well-being framework origin story, where it came from and how it is showing up here in the U.S., and share a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing locally at the community level with a wide variety of groups and sectors. So as many of you know, and as Alexandra's opening really articulated, well-being has been a topic that has not only gotten the interest in the US, but really started outside of the US. It's been a global topic for a few years now. And a lot of this has been about how do we move beyond just measuring economic progress to understanding some of those dimensions that Alexandra laid out, that we needed to understand how people were connecting to each other, whether individuals had a sense of purpose and meaning, that there was something beyond the gross domestic product that we needed to understand in order to understand economic progress. So, for example, well-being has been part of the way that the United Kingdom has also been assessing its economy. Many years ago, New Zealand was the first country to reveal a well-being budget. But this is not just European or OECD countries. This has been emergent in areas in South America, Latin America, in Asia, with the Bhutanese focus on happiness, different countries have come to the conversation about well-being, principally understanding that what makes life worth living isn't always showing up in what we measure and what we prioritize in government policy. In the US, a lot of this conversation has taken even greater root in the last couple of years, and particularly as a result of concerns about topics like the diseases of despair, rise in concern about the crisis of mental health, concerns about social connection and social isolation. And we talk about four trends that have been converging in the US for some time that really have opened up the space for the well-being conversation so that states like North Carolina, as well as other states and other communities in the US, are really now moving this agenda forward. And so as we talk about these four trends, it's always good to remind ourselves of this because it shows up not only in why well-being is taken hold in some of our conversations, but also how we might measure and act upon it. So we know as a country, we're experiencing significant demographic shifts, both geographically and culturally. We're increasingly concerned about widening gaps in inequity and inequality. We know that technology is expanding in ways that are both positive, but also could have some negative implications. And of course, I don't have to tell folks in North Carolina, we are experiencing a range of environmental stresses, whether through disasters, through climate change, through other pressures in our environment. And these things combine to have really created a lot more momentum in the last few years that have given rise to why in the US people have been more interested in what's been happening globally. Now, the way that we think about well-being, a lot of attention has been paid to this idea of, sorry, this keeps moving a little bit faster than I would want. A lot of attention has been paid to this idea of individual well-being. So when we talk about well-being, people talk about the World Happiness Report. They talk about findings from a couple of weeks ago that people are less optimistic and less hopeful in the US compared to other countries. And that's really important as we think about issues of anxiety, mental health, pessimism, and the like. But well-being is not simply about the individual circumstance of how you feel about yourself and your surroundings. It's also really guided by structures and systems and conditions. So a lot of the work that I and others have been advancing is more in the outer circles of this visual that we created. What is it about the conditions, the amenities, the culture of the community that we live in? How are we organized in terms of our governance and our policies, the civic well-being of the community? And then how does that intersect with the well-being of our environment and our planet? The relationship between people and planet is as important as many of the attention that we've been paying to individual happiness or individual well-being. Now, in recent years and months of the conversation, we've started to move even farther in the way that we think about well-being. So this visual, and I won't read everything, tries to explain where we're going in terms of the well-being conversation in a lot of communities here in the US. So individual well-being, as I've said, is really the state in which people are experiencing satisfaction in their life and realizing their full potential. That's important. But it's nested in that idea of community well-being. What are the social, economic, environmental, and political conditions identified by individuals and families, so culturally driven, that allow people to flourish and live their full potential? So what does it mean to not only have basic needs met, but also to experience that sense of purpose and dignity and meaning? Now, the challenge has been in the last few years that a lot of focus has moved in this direction, and that's great. But something has been missing. So when we talk about the concerns about social disconnection and the fact that communities are maybe not as thriving as they could be, one of the pieces that we've been missing is this idea of collective well-being, which we call the connections between individuals and community well-being. So you can have all the wonderful investments and community conditions and still not have a sense of collective well-being. What we say is that collective well-being is really the connections between people and people, people and institutions that serve them, and people and nature, so that when places or cultures are characterized by strong collective well-being, those communities can build the collective will and connected experiences to work together to build a future together. And in many cases, our measurement to date has not yet addressed that, but that's where we're going in a lot of the community work here in the US. So I wanted to name that as an emerging area of well-being that's important to consider. Now, when we've done a lot of work at the community level, we've thought about where communities are getting stuck. They're often getting stuck in how they're talking about the importance of well-being. They're getting stuck in what they're measuring and prioritizing. And they're getting stuck in how they're aligning their policies and their systems to advance well-being. So I'll talk just briefly about a couple of examples from communities where we've done that, just to give you a sense of things. And then I'm happy to talk offline with anybody who's interested in this work. Certainly, we link to things on the slides. And the idea of thinking about all three we call the legs of the stool, or the concentric circles that we visually depict here, is that if you don't understand your community narrative, you can't really connect the values of that community to what you measure. If you don't understand your measurement in a way that you can act on it, then you can't really identify actions that are going to advance things like positive health and well-being. And if your leadership is not talking about well-being, just like they're talking about the gross domestic product, it's really hard to mobilize for health and well-being, prosperity, and all the things that matter in the context of a well-being narrative and a well-being economy. So let me just briefly talk about narrative. So we've done a lot of work on how to advance well-being narratives. All of this is freely downloadable, and we've done it with a group called Metropolitan Group that I've had the privilege of working with on social change and social mobilization. And the way that Metropolitan Group defines narrative is critically important. Sometimes when we talk about doing communications campaigns, we're talking about kind of surface level. How are we using social media? How are we using banners and public communications about a topic? That's all very important. But when we're talking about shifting a society or a set of communities towards well-being, we're going deeper. We have to reframe the way that we consider what's valuable as a society, what matters, and how we prioritize that. So we go deep on values and mindset. And when we change those frames, which happens over time, then we can change the messaging, we can change the stories, and ultimately move politics, policy, and communities towards a well-being narrative. So one of the things that is really important in this work is how do we move away from a community or a national narrative that has tended to be fairly consumption-based, right? What are we producing, but what are we consuming? Tends to be fairly extractive in the way that we think about the exchange of goods and resources, and unfortunately has falsely created an idea that this is zero sum, right? The idea that there are trade-offs, and in order to have well-being, you have to take from one group to give to another. A well-being narrative in opposition to that is really thinking about how are we balancing choices and investments that ensure that we are addressing human and planet-centered decision-making, that ensures that people get what they need, but are also meeting those needs of purpose and dignity. So going back to the flower chart, how are we working at both individual, community, civic, and collective well-being levels? That's what we're trying to shift. Now, in our work, we've actually worked with communities in the US to take this idea of shifting to a well-being narrative and trying it out. So if you go to these guides that I have on the screen, you will see examples of communities that tried out a well-being narrative. but also organizations within communities that tried to advance a well-being narrative. So there's examples from Jackson, Mississippi, that has been working on a dignity economy for several years. There's examples from youth organizations that wanted to work at the youth level to start to think about a well-being narrative. So I won't go into too many details from these examples, but one of the things that we did was we actually took the idea of shifting frames towards well-being narratives and identified a set of messages and terms that could resonate across diverse constituent groups. And we knew that grassroots leaders might be ahead on some of these concepts of well-being, right? Because they've been working at it from the vantage point of dignity or creating more connected economies. But we also knew that there was an opportunity with business leaders and policy leaders who were starting to understand the focus on well-being, whether if it comes from an employee well-being perspective, a shareholder perspective, a concern about productivity and innovation. They were coming at this from their perspective as well. And we tested a bunch of words that got at underlying concepts of well-being. And what you see in the Venn diagram, particularly in the overlapping areas, is the language around well-being that was most motivating and most common in terms of why well-being matters and how we could start to advance a well-being frame. So people responded to this idea of connection, which is good, given that we're talking about collective well-being. They understood this idea of purpose and what it means to have purpose. They understood the idea around peace, and they understood the idea around health. How holistically people define health is always an open question, but they understood that social, spiritual, emotional, and physical health mattered. So as we tested some of these message points, we started to see where people had resonance. The idea of dignity, purpose, connection came up. The idea of belonging was shared across pretty disparate constituent bases. And not surprisingly, the idea of opportunity was resonant. So why does this matter? Well, as part of thinking about narrative frames, we have to think about how we are addressing some of these messages, how we are building on words and terms and stories and ideas and concepts that will bring people to the table, get them excited, and help them move to action. And so I share this as just an example of some of the things that we have been doing in narrative work. We actually work at the community level to help shift narrative thinking. So I'll briefly talk a little bit about these other two buckets with two examples. So more than a decade ago, we worked with the city of Santa Monica, which has now been a model for other communities in the US, to say, what would it mean if a city government wasn't just about filling the potholes and making sure that people had their permits filled and all the important things that governments do, but was about actually improving the well-being of its residents? How could government sit in relationship with civil society, the nonprofit sector, the private sector in advancing this cause? This was part of the Bloomberg Challenge Mayor's Award that happened about a decade ago about transforming city government. And Santa Monica took that call and took it in a very interesting way. So at the time, there had been a lot of well-being thinking, but a lot of it was very traditional measurement. The Canadian Well-Being Index had existed, and people were measuring certain dimensions of well-being, and those matter: environmental, economic, social. But what had been missing at the time of that work was that there hadn't been an integration between how you actually take measurement, which is a great thing that psychologists and economists and other analysts do, with actually making it real for policy and budgetary work. How could you bring disparate agencies together around a well-being agenda and use it for local resource allocation? So we actually convened all the international experts that exist on happiness, well-being, life satisfaction, you name it. We were fortunate to bring them together. And we paired them with people who do roll up the sleeves local government and policy work. And we said, what is an actionable framework that builds on the science of well-being, identifies domains that matter, but is still flexible enough that not only Santa Monica can use it, but other communities can tailor it to the data and the interests of their population or their needs. And we came up with what was called the Civic Wellbeing Framework. At the top, you see the 5 dimensions of well-being that we identified. At the bottom, you see some of the sample measures that Santa Monica cared about, but these measures are fungible and flexible by design so that people can take the domains and apply it to their community reality. At the time, what was novel about our work is that we didn't want to only rely on survey data. We wanted to make it as accessible and as tractable at the local level. And that meant administrative data where governments actually can use it, in sustainable and social media data. So, for example, Santa Monica was shocked to find out, as much as they thought of themselves as a community with connected neighborhoods, that they had this many people who were feeling stressed out. They also found that they were lower than the national average, which was contrary to common perspectives, that their neighbors didn't feel like they could count on each other. At the time, this was revelatory. Of course, today we now know that we are in a crisis around social connection and social isolation. So Santa Monica took this and actually created a well-being budget that tied to this framework. They had it inform downtown community strategic plans. Every government agency had to say how they were attending to the domains of the well-being framework, and it became something that was applied locally. I just want to briefly mention something else and another way to think about measurement. So we spend a lot of time thinking about gross domestic product as a country, and certainly right now we're talking about it a lot because of the tariff policy. Well, a few years ago, we started to say, well, that's not really completely a measure of a society. A measure of a society is how we measure the potential of the society, not merely the lagging indicator of what a society produces. And one of the things that we don't measure enough is the potential of a society at the youngest ages. So we began to create something called the Gross Developmental Potential, or the GDP2. It was really the first attempt to capture what are we investing at the youngest age groups in order to say, this is a country that's investing in the well-being and the potential of young people before they age and before they are the leading contributors to the society. So I'm not going to go over this framework, but it is another way to think about well-being, which is the idea that there are a set of capacities and capabilities that communities invest in, a la what does communities invest in with young people, that gets turned on through opportunity, and that potential creates the conditions for a society that is demonstrating well-being or the ability of people to thrive and flourish. What was unique about that work was essentially thinking about 21st century capabilities that young people need that are developmental. So essentially what we are measuring is the gross developmental potential of a nation. What are the investments that we are making in order to help people thrive and flourish? So it's another way of looking at the well-being framework, and I wanted to share that today. And with that, I will turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. That was amazing. Such a wealth of information about how this framework is being used in other places. Please take a moment if you have questions to visit the bottom of your screen in the Q&A box. We'll be getting to questions after we hear from Logan and then Cass. So I'll turn it to you, Logan.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And Katerina, could you bring the slides back up? So my name is Logan Rockefeller Harris. I'm the Director of Research at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. Great, that's a great place to be. I am gonna just take a few moments to share information about some of the tools that we use to kind of try to measure and understand economic well-being. I will say that, Anita, hearing from your presentation, I was having all sorts of thoughts about other exciting and more integrated things that we could try to measure, but I did want to share the tools that we currently produce and just a little bit of background about them. And so the first one are our county economic snapshots. This is a resource that we release every year that includes key economic and social indicators for every county in North Carolina, as well as for the state as a whole. And these include some what I think are sort of traditional measures of, the economy. For example, looking at employment rates, income levels. But we also, when thinking about the economy, want to bring in some of these ideas around well-being and whether people are kind of able to meet their needs. So we also look, for example, at housing affordability, at measures of health like life expectancy, and at educational attainment, and at income levels, for example, by educational attainment. And for some of these measures, we also provide breakdowns by race and gender, understanding that we need to, if we want to build an equitable economy, we also have to understand how people are experiencing the economy by race and gender, for example. We've dropped a link to this resource in the chat, and we'll also be following up on it. You can go to the next slide. Oh, I thought there was one more, but that's fine. I do just want to mention the county snapshots are available at that link, both downloadable as like PDFs. So people, if you have a kind of a one sheet that you want to use for your county, great, and here it is. And then we also have a series of visuals, specifically maps, that kind of make it easier to compare the measures across the state by county. And so if you do use this data, we're always really interested to hear how people are using it and what they're doing with it. So would welcome you to reach out and give us feedback, including if there are additional measures that you would like to see in the future, because we always want to ensure that these are as relevant as possible. Go to the next slide. So the second tool that I'm going to talk about, which we have generally released every 2 years and did release at the beginning of 2025, is called the Living Income Standard. And this is our attempt to look at what it takes to make ends meet for families in every county across the state. And so we do that by estimating the cost of living for a variety of family types. So that means looking at, households with 1 or 2 adults and with a variety of children and numbers of children, and then also look at a series of household needs to add up kind of what we know about those costs and see what income does a family need in order to really, be able to kind of achieve this basic standard of living. So we look at food, housing, childcare, healthcare, transportation, taxes, some other miscellaneous necessities that include things like clothing and basic household items and educational materials, and then a very small amount of savings. And I will emphasize that this is we call it a living income standard, not necessarily a thriving income standard. So there's not a lot of wiggle room in this measure for things like there's nothing that accounts for eating at a restaurant, for example, or going on vacation. Go to the next slide. And this is just a sample. This is available at the website, which we also dropped via a link into the chat that shows in a given month, if we're looking at the average in North Carolina, what the living income standard is for a family with 2 adults and 2 children, what are the costs that make up that living income standard? And so, not surprisingly, for many people, you'll see that the biggest costs tend to be housing and childcare. And so that, I think, can also help point us to what kind of investments our state and local governments could make into some of these, basic needs for families, that we can use public funds to make those more affordable and thus, make it possible for more families to thrive. And on that site, if you go to the site that's linked on the slide, as well as dropped in the chat, you'll be able to look that information up for every county, as well as for, like I said, a variety of family types. Go to the next slide. And another thing that we do with this data, and I know this is a bunch of numbers, so you are welcome to explore the website sort of at your own pace, but look at how the living income standard, and the number on here is still showing that standard for a family of 2 adults and 2 children, at the North Carolina average. That annual living income standard, which is over $97,000 a year, how does that compare to other, income standards, like, for example, the federal poverty level or full-time work at minimum wage? So the minimum wage in North Carolina is $7.25 per hour. That's now a lower level than the federal poverty level, but we see that neither of those measures come kind of anywhere close to meeting the living income standard when we actually look at the cost of those basic needs. And we're also able to kind of translate this into an hourly wage. So when we're looking at that household with 2 adults and 2 children, each would need to make over $23 an hour, which we know is far higher than our minimum wage. Whereas if they were working at minimum wage, they would each need to work 129 hours a week, which is clearly totally unsustainable. So this is a tool, again, that we develop both to try to understand what's an income that allows people to meet, if not necessarily full well-being, because it's a kind of basic standard, but what is the income that helps folks meet those basic needs and helps us assess whether given wages or job opportunities, for example, meet that level. Go to the next slide. Oh, that was it. So I did, that was what I had to share. I'm very happy to answer questions about either of these resources. Please drop those in the Q&A. And I will pass it back to Alexandra.
Great, thanks. I actually saw Cass come online, so maybe Cass, can you jump in and share your perspective? Thank you so much, Logan, for sharing those tools. And Cass, excited to hear about your work with the living income standard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me on this call. My name is Cass Otley. I'm the international representative of UE150, the North Carolina Service Workers Union. And this tool has been amazing for us, first of all, to really show all the challenges that workers have as far as paying rent, childcare, and all of those things and how they add up. It's been a great tool for us during the budget season to be able to actually show the baseline of what a worker would need to make to be able to live and thrive within the city of Charlotte. I've used it in Greensboro, Raleigh, and it's really been helpful. Just to give them the visual when we're in the meetings with the mayor and the city manager. We've used it with city council members, and to let them, see, it's different to talk about it. It's better when you can actually visualize it and see it. And the way it's broken down, showing you the poverty level and all of those different things have been very helpful for us. We have a lot of people that have, asked for the website, have gone back over and looked up other information on it. So it's been an amazing tool for us. I mean, here in Charlotte, we've been able to raise the minimum wage from $18.58 3 years ago to now currently it's $23 an hour. And we've been using this tool to slowly move it up so that workers can live and thrive in the area and the cities that they live in.
Thank you so much, Cass, for sharing that perspective. And I know we'll have some questions for you. It's been great to hear more about the ways in which a well-being framework can help support the conversations we need to be having about what people and communities need, how it's being done across the country, how it's being used, how tools like this are being used here in North Carolina. And we're excited to continue to be in conversation with you all. I did want to open it up now to respond to some of the questions, if that's okay. We have one question from Linda. who makes an important point that in the US, individualism has been a common theme. There are some populations, of course, who are more aligned by collectivism, but our power systems still emphasize individualism. How do we shift the US into recognizing the value of connections and the potential for well-being? I don't know, Anita, if you want to start, and if any of the other folks want to join in, that would be great.
Sure, I'm happy to. That's a great question. One of the things that we actually do with communities when we're working on well-being narratives and how to craft narratives that advance is to kind of address this issue of individualism and community and collective. And there are some deeply rooted beliefs in certain populations, in certain communities in the US that have to be lifted up and discussed and addressed. But we have found a couple of different entry points to start the conversation around connection and collective. One is actually talking to communities about the things that they value about the places that they live and work. And in many cases, communities talk about neighborhood pride. They talk about work ethic, and they talk about kind of fundamental values that you might expect communities, particularly in the US, to talk about. That actually becomes an entry point to talk about how connection, community, and collective features in the ideas of work ethic, right? We work together in places of employment. We work together to build neighborhoods and community. Neighborhood pride, what are the points of connection that people have, whether it's a sporting event or coming together after disaster response and recovery? We use those values. We sort of build on the hyper-Americanisms of individualism, but shift to look at its component parts and tell more of a connection, a networked story of community that people can grab onto. And that begins a conversation where we then tie those community values to stories of prosperity or stories of health or stories of dignity. And it gives us an entry point. It's been really important to meet communities where they are and the language they use, and then transform that. And so when we did that message testing that you saw that I shared from our group, work with Metropolitan Group, words like connection can have resonance, but it's really about the stories and the way that you build on community-driven values that matters. One of the things that I think in policy work, we are often a little bit afraid of is to talk about values. I'm a public health researcher by training. In public health, we are also afraid of talking about values, but actually putting those values, those mindsets, community histories on the table is the only way you're going to get to those root issues of that narrative tree. And so we roll up our sleeves and start there, and it's a process. But it is addressable, but you're right. There are dominant narratives, and replacing those are not easy, but it is possible.
That's great, Anita. Thank you. And it gives us a pathway here in North Carolina to continue working towards that goal. We do have one more question in the Q&A box, and it's data specific. Logan, I don't know if you can answer this or maybe say whether we have this data, but Tina's asking, do you have a count of how many two-parent family households and single-parent households in North Carolina there are? I think this may be relevant for understanding what share of the state's population fits under different individual living income standard measures.
Yeah, and it looks like there was also just a question about if there's a cost or a living income standard for single people or single parent households. And we do include that. So we have a living income standard for an individual adult as well as for a single parent with 1 or 2 children. There is, and I guess I'll just speak a little bit to the importance of that. We think it is really important to not assume, what the structure of a family looks like, or assume that there would be, 2 full-time people working to support children. And what that is something that has, I think, always been important as we've calculated the living income standard to include it for single adult as well as 2 adult households. There is data available on how many families have two-parent versus single parents. So that's available from the US Census. We don't have it, and I haven't collected it already. But if that was something that somebody was interested in for their community, please reach out to me, and it's something that we can provide and also think about as we continue to sort of publish and use the data in the living income standard. We want to know how to make it more useful to understand what's going on in our state. And so that's the kind of thing that we could incorporate into future analyses.
Thanks, Logan. That's great. I have one question too for Cass, if that's okay. This is a question about policy change. So we know that people in North Carolina aren't all seeing policy that matches their priorities. What are ways that you've seen be effective to reconnect the policymaking process to people? And what is the role of talking about well-being in that work? You talked a little bit about your work with city or county officials using the living income standard, but do you have any thoughts for folks on the call about how do we reconnect the policy process to the realities in community that people are facing every day?
I think, first of all, teaching people about the policies, because a lot of people don't know what the policies are. They don't know how they affect them. So one, just really informing them about the policies, but also, we have meetings where, we talk about some of the policies that are failing us, and we talk about what do we need? How would we like to change this? What is the language that we need in this policy that would be inclusive to everyone? So just making sure that people are in the room, they understand the policy, they understand, how it needs to be changed, and then we frame it and we change it. And instead of, giving it to, the lawmakers or the leaders and say, hey, this is broken, can you fix it? We're coming in with, this is what we'd like to see in this policy, which is very different. So, having folks take ownership and really making sure that, it's framed in a way that's going to support, living and thriving lives for everyone.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I think that's all the questions we have. Again, feel free to be in touch with us and we will work to get you answers. We will be sending a follow-up note. Before I close, I just want to thank our panelists for such a wonderful conversation about well-being frameworks. We would love to get your feedback on this event now if you have time. We know it's hard to remember to fill out evaluation forms. So we'll put that in the chat. If you can stay on, grab that link and give us some feedback so we can continue to design these sessions to get you the information that you need in your work. And then I want to invite you all to help us. We are working to try and understand and build the understanding of well-being across our state. And we have a call to action that is an opportunity for you to share your ideas about well-being. What does well-being look like to you for your community? And if you can share that link as well with your networks, even better. The more input we get, we hope to be able to bring this forward in conversations with policymakers. Finally, just to say, we really are interested in North Carolina being at the leading edge of this conversation about well-being frameworks. We know it will take all of us working together to shift the narrative, to use the measures in ways that can change systems and policies. And I'm here to say that I think the Budget and Tax Center is excited about this work, but we know we need to do it in collaboration with you all and with the community across our state. We are seeing some exciting progress in the General Assembly with legislation introduced just last week to establish some more regular reporting on broader measures of economic progress and success. We'll share more about those bills in our follow-up email and hope to see those get a hearing this session. Again, we can't wait to continue the work with you on well-being frameworks and really grateful for you all taking the time to be with us today. Thank you so much. Thank you again to our panelists, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.